Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. It is time again for Bible study as we are on this Thursday, October 22nd. It is a rainy day in Old Nevada Town, Iowa. And welcome. Glad you stopped by to join us for Bible study. We are working our way through the book of Acts, and we are in chapter 13 of Acts, which means we are looking at the first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas. And remember, we were told last time that things started out originally as Barnabas and Paul, and now it's Paul and Barnabas. And that Barnabas was good with that. Barnabas was not a guy who wanted to be there in the limelight. He didn't want the footlights. He was one who was willing to be a complementary piece, and he knew that Paul was the one who had the leadership skills and the ability to take charge. And so away they go. So we're up to verses 14 and 15 now of chapter 13. So if you're following along in your own Bible, and I hope you are, that's where we are at. So from Perga, they went through the country and arrived at Pisidian Antioch. They went into the synagogue on the first day of the week and sat down. After the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them with this message: Brothers, if you have any word of exhortation to say to the people, say on. Now, there's a couple of things here that, if you just pass over the reading of these first couple of sentences, you're going to miss out on it. Pisidian Antioch, this is not the same Antioch where we have one of the original churches over in Canaan area in Palestine, Syria. This is over now in Turkey, in the Roman province of Galatia. It is to this church and to the churches of Iconium, Lystra, Derbe that the original epistle or letter to the Galatians is going to be written. Galatians actually should mean to the churches in Galatia, in the province of Galatia. Now, to get there from Perga, which is on the coast, you have to go and travel one of the nastiest roads in all of Asia Minor. You're going to go from sea level up to Pisidian Antioch. You're going to be going about 3,600 feet above sea level. So it's a rough and a rugged road. It's also beset, notorious for bandits and people who are looking to rob caravans and stray travelers, kind of like the Good Samaritan parable, only that was the road down to Jericho, which is also equally infamous. There are just certain places where there are places for robbers to hide and do ambushes, and this happened to be one of those places. Now, so to go there, it's a dangerous journey for Paul and Barnabas. We don't know if it was just the two of them, or maybe they attached themselves to a caravan or something like that for protection, but this is a risky little trip that they're going to. You also, if you look at the book of Galatians, you will find that there Paul says, When I first came to you, I came to you in sickness and much weakness. So it's often speculated, well, what was wrong with Paul at this point? Well, you recall that Paul will tell us that he has a thorn in the flesh. The word thorn is actually not the best translation. It actually might be better translated spike or stake, a tent stake. Remember, Paul by trade was a tent maker. He'd be familiar with tent stakes, and so something like that is he uses to describe his malady. Now, what exactly was wrong with Paul? We're not sure. There's been speculation over the years, for example, that he had problems with his eyesight, other things, migraines, for example. It is speculated here that Paul might have had malaria. And this particular kind of malaria was along the low levels along the coastal towns of the Mediterranean, and actually would run kind of rampant. And one of the characteristics of this kind of malaria was splitting horrific headaches that would just literally would cripple a person. Very much. If you suffer from migraines or maybe a real nasty toothache in the upper part of your jaw, you have an idea, maybe a little bit of what Paul would go through, what this thorn in the flesh might be. And so, possibly, as they are there in Perga, he might have had a flare up of his malaria and was beset by weakness, would be fever, would be another thing, as well as horrifically painful headaches. So, to, they might have been making this particular journey because they wanted to get away from the coastal area where the malaria would cause flare ups. And wanted to get up to higher elevations, perhaps. Paul felt better there. It was cooler there, or whatever the case may be. Says they set out and they went through the country and they arrived then at Pisidian Antioch, which is a relatively young city. It is a major town, but it's a relatively new city. It would have been founded most likely by one of the successors of Alexander the Great as he made his conquests through Turkey and working his way towards the east. And so that means it's a relatively new city. And in new cities in that part of the world, the Jews would generally flock to those cities because they like to be able to get in on the ground floor of things in terms of establishing businesses, establishing their community, their way of life, get a fresh start. And so they are a number of Jewish communities and synagogues in these particular cities. They're in Derbe and Iconium, those places there in the province of Galatia. And so they end up there in Pisidian Antioch. And they go there, and that's why there's a synagogue there for them to go to. They probably would have asked around, and they found it. And this was Paul and Barnabas's general way of working. They would go and they would find the synagogue, and they would go first to the Jews. Almost always, that was the plan. Go first to the Jews. And we'll see how this works out. Now, Paul and Barnabas would be recognized immediately as visitors. They're new faces in town, just like when we have new people walk into church. All of a sudden, it's, oh, there's new folks here. Better find out about them. And it would not have been long before they found out that this is Paul, who is a Pharisee, come from Jerusalem, not too long from Jerusalem and from Antioch. And so he's a teacher. And that is respected. And so the way a service would work in the early synagogue is that after the singing of the psalms and prayers, they would read the law and the prophets and the scrolls. And then they didn't have a resident rabbi per se. They had the leaders, the elders, and the president of the synagogue. They were responsible for ordering the life of the synagogue and the setting up the service. But if you had special guests come in, and somebody who has notoriety as a teacher, as a rabbi, you invite them to give an exhortation. It's not like, we invite somebody in to preach for some reason or another, and we give them a couple of months' notice, and they come in and they have a prepared message. It's, no, here's a rabbi, do you have anything to say to us, Rabbi, today? Give an exhortation. So this is the formal invitation that they give to Paul and Barnabas. And guys, if you got something to say to us, we'd really be glad to hear it. So that takes us now up to verse 16. Now, this is a fairly long passage, and I think I'm going to read it all. It's verse 16 to 41. This is one of the very few examples we have of what looks to be pretty much a full sermon from Paul. We have a full sermon, give or take, from Peter earlier on the day of Pentecost and in other places. And so it's interesting for us to have this and to be able to compare now what it is that Paul is preaching, along with what Peter is preaching and others. So, verse 16. Then Paul stood up, made a gesture with his hand, and said, "You Israelites, and you who are God-fearers, listen to this. The God of this people, Israel, chose out our fathers, and he exalted the people when they lived as strangers in the land of Egypt. And with a lofty arm he brought them forth from it. For 40 years he bore with their ways in the wilderness. He destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan and gave them possession of their land for about 450 years. And after that, he gave them judges up to the time of Samuel the prophet. And thereafter, they asked for a king. And God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. God removed him and raised up David as king for them. In testimony to him, he said, I found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all the things that I wish. It was from the seed of this man, according to his promise, that God brought Jesus, a Savior for Israel, after John the Baptist had previously preached before his coming a baptism of repentance to all the people of Israel. When John was fulfilling his course, he said, What do you suppose me to be? No, I am not he, but look you, there is coming after me one the shoe of whose feet I am not fit to unloose. Brethren, you who are the sons of the race of Abraham, you God-fearers among us, it was for us that the word of this salvation was sent out. Those who live in Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize this man, and they fulfilled the words of the prophets which are read every Sabbath when they condemned him in judgment. Though they found in him no charge which merited the death penalty, they asked Pilate that he should be put to death. And when they had completed all that had been written about him, they took him down from the tree and put him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and he was seen for many days by those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. And they are now witnesses of him to the people. And we bring to you the good news of that promise that was made to the fathers. We tell you that God has fulfilled this to our children by raising up Jesus, even as it stands written in the second Psalm, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. And when he raised him from the dead, no longer to return to destruction, he spoke thus, I will give to you the holy things of David which are faithful, because he says in another passage, Thou wilt not allow thy Holy One to see corruption. For David, in his own generation, served the will of God and fell asleep, and he was added to his fathers, and he did see corruption. But the one whom God raised up did not see corruption. Let this be known to you, brethren, that through this man the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to us, and from all the things from which you could not be acquitted by the law of Moses, everyone who believes in this man is acquitted. So then, take heed, lest there come upon you that which was spoken in the prophets, see you despisers, and wonder, and be wiped out from the sight, because I work a work in your days, a work in which you will not believe, even if someone tell it to you. Now, I know this is a long and laborious kind of passage to read, almost like listening to a sermon. Ha! It is a sermon, that's why. But this is the kind of preaching that you had in the early church. They would, when especially they're talking to a Jewish audience, they would recite back into Jewish history. Again, reminding them, these are the people that you are, this is from whence you came, and that God has chosen us out, and they would go back over history a little bit. But then they would put one reason they were doing that was to firmly establish Jesus within the realm of Judaism, that Jesus was indeed a Jew, and that Jesus is the promised one. And they would go back to the prophets, and they would look at the prophets that were talking about the coming of Messiah, and they would claim that this Jesus is indeed the fulfillment of those prophecies. Now, when you compare this to what Peter was talking about in Acts chapter 2, you see that basically the same elements are here. Paul insists, for example, that Jesus is the consummation of history. He outlines the national history of the Jewish people and makes the case that this now is being culminated in this Jesus of Nazareth. He is making the point that history has a process. A lot of people in that day and age did not believe that history had a goal, had a point, was going somewhere. The Stoics believed that history was cyclical, went in cycles, and that ultimately one cycle would be destroyed in a cataclysmic kind of a series of events, and then it would start all over again. That's what the Cynics did, the Stoics. And different people had different ideas, but the Christian faith says that history has a starting point and it has a goal. It will have a culminating point. One of those culminating points then is that Jesus is the Messiah, and this now is the beginning of the consummation of the age. You can look forward to that. Paul states that also, along with Peter, that men, Jews in particular, did not recognize Jesus as this Messiah, and that he was crucified, that he was wrongfully crucified, and that he was crucified upon the tree. Although men rejected him, God could not be defeated, and that God rose Jesus then from the dead. Peter again proclaims this also, and that the resurrection then is proof of the undefeatable, undeniable purpose of God. That God's purpose is that the Messiah has come, and the Messiah is here to fulfill God's law, and that people will be restored and redeemed. This is proof that God has never and will never lose his grip on history. God is indeed in control. Then Paul goes on, and because he's talking to Jews predominantly, it wasn't just Jews. There were God-fearers there as well, Gentiles, Romans perhaps, and other groups of people who were, they had not converted entirely, but they were there. They were listening. They were fascinated with Judaism, and they were getting as close as they could without getting too close. A lot of these were women, and we'll see this in the next section as we check it out, that women found a sense of freedom and fulfillment in Judaism that they did not find in the other old Roman and Greek gods. And so you would see a lot of women, Gentile women, that were God-fearers. We'll see this in the next section. I won't do a spoiler alert here. We'll save that for what happens next, but just trust me on that one. And then Paul is also talking here about the coming of Christ to one group of people is good news. This is the good news of the gospel. The resurrection of Jesus Christ and his ascension means that we are the people of redeemed, that are going to be redeemed. This is good news. For another good group of people, this is not good news. For those who do not believe, this is judgment. Not that God is judging them, but they're judging themselves because they are rejecting the Lamb of God, that they are accepting God's offer of righteousness. Paul's making the point, you can't fulfill the law on your own. Jesus is the fulfillment of that law. And that now that you have heard, there's no excuse. You are without excuse now. So if you choose to believe, good news. If you choose not to believe, well, not so much. Same thing true today. Although once you hear and you are responsible, that doesn't mean, well, that's it then. If you hear you today and this is the hour of decision, and after that, no more. No, God is a God of second chances and third chances. But eventually time does run out. And after we die, then comes the judgment, we're told. So it behooves us now to make that decision and commitment of faith now as we hear it. Now, this takes us up to the events that transpire in verses 42 to 52. And I think I'm going to hold off on those for right now. We'll pick it up then at verses 42 and 52 as we look at, okay, Paul has preached now what exactly is going to be the results of that preaching, because this is not just the missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas. This could be better be titled The Adventures of Paul and Barnabas, as well as the establishment of the early church. Remember, Paul will go from town to town to town. He establishes church and leaderships, and then he moves on. But a lot of times, did he move on because he wanted to, or because he got run out of town? That is always the question. So we'll pick things up here next time. That's our Bible study for today. I hope the Lord is with you today and just encouraging you, meeting you at your point of need, whatever that would happen to be on this dreary, rainy old day in Nevada, Iowa. Hope the Lord blesses you real good. Thanks for stopping by today.